Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Red Pill Religion podcast. Red Pill Religion, where among the things we say that should be non-contentious, men's rights are human rights. And if we need feminism, then we need to talk about men's issues too. So please support our work on redpillreligion.com. Please remember, in these days of social media censorship, you'll always find us on redpillreligion.com. And please, if you like this kind of content, where we challenge the dominant cultural narratives on both the right and the left, and talk about multiple issues that matter that don't get covered in the mainstream press, please go ahead and hit our PayPal tip jar, our Bitcoin tip jar. We're happy to get your support on Subscribestar or even on Patreon. Or if you like what we do, please be sure to check out our shirts and mugs, which are available for sale on the redpillreligion.com site. And we'll probably start putting a link on our videos to add those as well. So we really could use your support. Please find us on gab.com, on Maker Support. No, Maker Support's gone, but find us on gab.com at Red Pill Religion, Facebook, Minds. You'll find us on all those platforms, so please look us up. Now, tonight, we're going to be, and please feel free to join our Discord chat room if you want to come in and debate with people. Now, joining me today is Carl. I'm always forgetting that entire name. Carl Reinhold Augustsson, right?
Pretty close. Reinhold Augustsson. Yeah, very close.
Carl Reinhold Augustsson. Okay, and I see he's got a brand new YouTube channel. You might want to go and check it out. He's only got a few subscribers to start, but go ahead and check him out. I see that you are talking about men's rights issues, and you are wearing the stereotypical fedora. Now, why did you choose to wear the stereotypical fedora?
Well, because one thing I always thought was strange is, why is it wrong for a man to wear a hat inside and not a woman? Now, I know when some of the feminists were getting going in the 20s, it was unladylike to smoke in public, so some would smoke on purpose. So I'm showing, why can't a man wear a hat inside? That's why I'm wearing this hat. And it's a much healthier way to make a statement than to smoke.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I mean, it's pretty funny. I've been doing men's rights stuff for quite a few years. I'm only semi-retired from it. I can tell you that we've been mocked for years for wearing that type of hat. And you're the first men's rights activist I ever met who actually wore that type of hat. But regardless of what got you interested in talking about feminism or talking about men's rights issues, Carl?
Well, I guess, some would say we were red-pilled from birth. I was red-pilled from a young age. Growing up as a boy in the 1980s in the United States, I saw the clear injustices against boys. I mean, one of the first stories I'll remember, and please don't think I've been traumatized for life about this or anything, but I remember it was summertime. I was 5, 6 years old, with my parents somewhere was living in Virginia, and a young woman who worked under my father came up to my sister, who's 2 years younger than I am, and just doted on her and loved her and didn't even notice I was there. And I offered my sister a stuffed animal. I said, well, I'll take one. No response. And later on I said it again. She turned and gave me this ugly glare. Now, my sister was too shy and she never got one anyway, but then the woman walked away. And my father said, I don't get it. We've taken her in, we've been nice to her, and yet she's got this chip on her shoulder. My mother at that point explained to me, there are people out there who think that men have treated women badly. My mother immediately said, now, I don't think that, but there are people out there who think that. As a young boy, I said, but that has nothing to do with me. And my mother said, you're right, it doesn't, and people shouldn't act like that. Now, I didn't think anything of it. I thought she's just a mean person and moved on. But I saw in school there were ways in which the teachers were clearly favoring the girls, and I didn't think it was right. And as time went on, I started to, in my mind, think of a list of disadvantages there are to being male. As a Swedish citizen, I knew Sweden had a military service requirement for men at the time, but not for women. About 5, 6 years later, I would realize that actually in Europe, Sweden was the rule, not the exception. Also, it was around that time, it was the 75th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, and I thought it was wrong that men had to go down the ship and women didn't. Isn't that kind of sexist? Where's the equality in this? So I was thinking, you know what? I don't like this sort of sexism. I believe in gender equality for both men and women. Then in the 6th grade, I mean, I thought the previous schools I went to were bad. I should mention, growing up, I went to 6 different schools in 5 different cities in 4 different states. This school was the worst school I went to when it came to sexism. I mean, worse than any of the others. Out of the 6 schools I went to, there was at least one example of discrimination against boys at 4. This was worse than the other 3 combined. It got so bad, I actually wrote a letter of complaint and started a federal investigation in my school by the Civil Rights Office for discrimination against boys. By the way, for the record, the investigation proved I was right. So now it's 1989. I'm not even quite 12 yet, and I've already done that. And already in my mind, I have a list of things that are unfair to males in society, like military service requirements, higher insurance prices, last of a sinking ship, and so on and so forth. Now, at the time, I heard feminists say, hey, we believe in equality. We have men covered too. I thought, fantastic. I found my movement. Well, within a few years, I was made aware of these quotes of all sex is rape. I want to see a man beaten to a bloody pulp. And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. That's what I was trying to get away from. And within a few years, I realized that no, feminism wasn't the answer. On the contrary, it was part of the problem.
Now, this is interesting. We got a bad echo coming from our side. Can you maybe adjust your settings or mute yourself when you're not talking? Okay, it seems to have stopped. What the heck was I going to say? So you're saying in 1989, at the age of 12, you filed a complaint and you were successful?
That's correct.
Well, interesting. Is it okay to ask which school it was?
Yeah, you will find this very interesting. And believe me, my views on this institution have changed 180, and I now adore it. Of the 6 schools I went to, half were public, half were private. 2 of the private schools I went to were Episcopal. This one was Catholic. And I know you are proud Catholic, and believe me, I adore the Catholic Church today. At the time, as a result of my experience, I despised the Catholic Church. Part of the reason I liked feminism for a few years was I saw it as a rival. St. Andrew's Catholic School, Fort Worth, Texas.
Well, what is it? St. what?
St. Andrew's Catholic School, Fort Worth, Texas.
But you filed back 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you filed a complaint against the St. Andrew's School in Fort Worth. Like with the federal office, or who did you file a complaint with?
Well, kind of a side note, I saw in the cafeteria there was a notice that if you feel you've been discriminated against, write to, I don't know why it was this. It was the Secretary of Agriculture. Okay. And I just took I just do what I'm told. The Secretary of Agriculture, kind of strange, but will do. Well, it turns out that was the wrong place to send it to, and it took months for the letter to bounce to the correct place.
But then it came back, and the Department of Agriculture, did they come to your school, or what happened?
No. It was sent to the correct Office of Civil Rights.
Oh, okay. And then the Office of Civil Rights contacted the school, and the school wound up admitting they were wrong?
They basically took the attitude, well, I guess we never thought about it. It was just kind of the way we always did things. Is it not the right way to do things?
But now you say you've done a 180 on this particular school?
Not the school, the Catholic Church in general. I mean, if you talked to me the first half of the 90s, I despised the Catholic Church because of my experience there.
Well, I can tell you honestly that if you go back in time, starting in the 70s, maybe the late 60s, but definitely the early 70s, when we were kids or not yet born, it's been documented there was a big change in who got into the seminaries and what was going on in the Catholic schools. Fulton Sheen, who's probably on his way to sainthood, recognized sainthood, in the 70s warned that if you wanted your kids to have a bad education, send them to a Catholic school, because they had become very political and very secularized. And it sounds like that's a lot of what you were experiencing probably then. And the only thing I'll say to that is as a Catholic, there have been a lot of people quiet about problems like this, excess injection of secular ideologies, excess injection of things like feminism and stuff like that. There's a real pushback happening to it, and it's growing within Catholic circles. You yourself are an Eastern Orthodox Christian, right?
Yeah, father's from Sweden, so I was baptized in Sweden as a Lutheran. My mother's Episcopalian. I was raised Episcopalian. I was an altar boy at one point, in fact, in the Episcopal Church. But I mean, as time went on, the Episcopal Church, I think, really has gone astray more than any other. Breaks my heart. So when I got engaged to my wife from the Republic of Georgia, where I'm right now, she said the priest here wants me to become Orthodox. Well, I needed a new church, and I was thrilled to become Orthodox. So yes, I am now Georgian Orthodox.
Well, I'm glad you found that. I mean, you know, as a good Catholic, I'm supposed to want everybody to be Catholic and all, but I know there's fights between the communions, and we're all in partial communion with each other now, and that's, you know, hopefully the differences will be resolved one day. I have great love for the Eastern Orthodox. The interesting thing is now you're talking about men's rights and their issues. How long have you been? Well, you've been talking about. How long have you been talking about it publicly on the internet? Just recently?
No, well, I first joined the National Coalition for Men back in 2010. They
I'm
made
a
me their
member
main
too.
contact for the Republic of Georgia back then. And I've been posting online about it. I'll tell you a bit of a story. I served in the Peace Corps in Bulgaria from 1999 to 2001. Now, I was one of the few Republicans in the group. Most of the people leaned left, but they were pretty friendly, and they took me in. They joked I was their token Republican, and everything seemed cool, even though I disagreed with them on many things. So in 2010, for International Men's Day, I sent out a mass email to all my Peace Corps colleagues telling about NCFM, National Coalition for Men, and say, hey, here's why you should get involved. I put up a video of a woman who read a bunch of feminist quotes like, you know, I want to see a man beaten to a bloody pulp, you know, all those that we've come to know so well. I listed all the disadvantages that are to being male. I listed the various things that NCFM sends its new members, like, you know, different problems men have, mainly U.S. based. And I added some, like, many countries have high retirement ages for men, for example. So I listed this long email. I mean, I spent weeks, poured my heart into it. I was not ready for some of the angry blowback I got. There was one guy in the group who actually, he went from being a Democrat to Republican. He supported me for a couple years. He was the only person in that group I would even speak to.
Huh, huh, huh. It is rather amazing, isn't it? I'm glad you're having some real success too. There have been one of the things I find is that whenever you talk about these issues, let's say the male suicide rate, the rampant discrimination against men and fathers in family courts, the problems of child abuse, and the reality that it's not men that commit most child abuse, it's women, especially moms, especially single moms. When you talk about any of these things, people, even more conservative-minded people and even some religious people get very uncomfortable, don't they?
Yes.
But the thing is, and I would actually say this very much from a Christian perspective, first off, the notion that Christians are expected to oppress their women is just garbage, and it always has been. But even from a Christian perspective, you ought to be able to look at some of these men's rights issues and say, you know what, the men's rights advocates are correct. In fact, I have a contention that feminism, or I have a belief that feminism is based on a psychological concept called androphobia, which you can find in contemporary literature. It's based on a rational fear of men. I actually think this fear of men, which is known to be a mental disorder in women for many, many, many generations, the feminism takes this and elevates this irrational fear and hatred of men to an ideology. And I have a feeling, I've observed this. I think males who go feminist, men who go feminist, are also suffering from a hatred of their fellow males. I think that's real obvious once you talk to enough male feminists. I don't know if you've had that experience.
Yeah, I have. It's not quite that, but I've noticed they're also very dismissive of anything that I mentioned, even though, I mean, I've had a pretty unique life. I mean, I was born with parents from two different countries. I've had two citizenships my whole life. I married a woman from
Swedish and American? Was it Swedish and American?
Yes. And then through marriage, I later attained a third citizenship. I've lived in 8 different countries, and I've traveled to 96 on 6 continents. So
Dang.
my life is somewhat unique, but still, surely I'm not the only man who noticed things like sexist service registration in the U.S., for example, and thought, but hey, that's kind of sexist, you know?
What sexist? What now? I didn't
I
hear your.
call it by its real name, sexist service registration.
Oh, so you mean selective service?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I go back and forth on that because, yeah, I think let's get real here. Women in combat is a bad idea, and it has been a bad idea all along. They're good for certain roles, but in general, you don't want them in combat roles. They cause problems in the ranks. That's what a lot of people say, anyway. So I never am quite sure what to say about the draft, except I don't think we should have one.
Well, I agree with you. I don't think we should have a draft. And I also hasten to add, draft does not equal combat.
Right.
For example, like in many European countries, thankfully numbers declined considerably in the last 25 years, but in many European countries, there was a mandatory service. You just served in the army,
Right.
in a war situation.
That's
And also,
Sweden, right?
if the war breaks out, we can draft women into non-combat positions.
Right. Right. I think that's actually the correct answer. I think it's inherently wrong that half the population, really a little more than half, women are a majority of voters in most countries, that they are able to vote to send others into combat, but they bear no price for that personally. Well, except maybe the loss of a husband or a brother or something, but in the final analysis, they're having the power to put men in harm's way, or at least force men to do things they might not want to do. I do think if we're going to have a draft at all, then you should be required to draft women, and women who say they want to go the same route as the males, if they can meet the physical standards, let them, but otherwise have, a draft for women to do things other than the combat stuff, so that women have they have skin in the game too.
You
I
heard
think
of Switzerland?
What about Switzerland?
I lived there once as an exchange student back in high school in the 90s. They are one of the few countries in Western Europe to still have a running draft, peacetime draft. And there was a referendum, I think it was 2014 or 15, to abolish it. 72% voted to keep it. And this angers me whenever I think about it. A majority of older men, older women, and younger women voted to keep it. A majority of younger men voted to abolish it. Worse yet, there was even a group, Women for Conscription. And okay, I get it. You lived in the society. That's the way things have been. I see where maybe you like it. Maybe you want to keep it. You vote to keep it. But really, you love it that much that you started a whole campaign, Women for Conscription.
This is not even new, by the way. If you read into something called the Second World War, and there was something like this in the First World War too, the White Feather Campaign. Have you ever heard about it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, during the White Feather Campaign, women during the war would run and find men who were not wearing uniforms or were obviously not in the army or joining or whatever, and hand them white feathers to indicate that they were cowards. So what you had was women running around, so-called feminists, although they didn't call themselves feminists back then, but whatever, shaming men. And it's like, well, but what are these women doing otherwise? What are they doing to contribute to the war effort? What are they doing to help men who are wounded or whatever? And no, people don't even remember the White Feather Campaign was a thing. And it is inherently wrong. To be honest with you, sometimes it even offends like some people on the Red Pill Religion team when I say it, but I'm like, really, we gave women the vote, and then we gave women but all these exemptions where they are not subject to the requirements that the men are. And I don't see how you can not see that as inherently wrong. Look, let's say if you look at it from a modernist perspective, of course it's unfair. If you look at it from, let's say, a traditional Christian point of view, most Christians, the educated ones, actually, anyway, say your Catholics, even your Lutherans and all that, understand there's this idea. Well, it is a Catholic concept originally. It's called a principle of complementarity, which holds that men and women aren't superior; they're just different, and they tend to complement each other. even under the principle of complementarity, the idea that women can force men into combat, but women can have no requirements put on them themselves, that inherently violates the idea of complementarity. The idea that, okay, if men and women are unequal in some area, if you're working within I can't say the name all of a sudden. Complementarity idea is that, well, okay, sometimes women are going to have to put up with things that men aren't, but here's a complementary obligation or downside for the men. Same here, you know, I mean, maybe you give women the right to vote and let them decide these things, but if there's going to be a draft, they have to be ready to be drafted, and if they're not up to the physical standards, then they have to be drafted to go be put into something other things, driving vehicles, running supply lines, being nurses and doctors, whatever it is, if they can't make the PT standards. The thing is that you can't get most people to see this. And I think what they really don't see is that when young men see all this, they see not only the fact that they're subject to the draft and everything else, but they see discrimination against themselves in all kinds of other areas from school going onward. I don't think many older people, older conservatives, or most women even think about this basic problem. And I think it's a big part of why a lot of men are dropping out and refusing to get married in the first place or to do much in society. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always been a bit of a hopeless romantic, and I always wanted to get married. And I never was worried I was never going to. I went 10 years without a girlfriend. Part of the reason, and this is one of the sorest points of me with feminism, I was scared to date because of sexual harassment hysteria. I thought the 90s were bad. My gosh, a return to the 90s at this point would be a breath of fresh air. Thought of myself as being a bit of a hopeless romantic. I always wanted to be married, but for many years I was worried I was never going to be. I went 10 years without a girlfriend, and this was back in the 90s. And part of the reason for this is I was scared to date because of all the sexual harassment hysteria. I mean, feminists made the rules so ridiculously ambiguous, I now know on purpose. And by the way, I thought the 90s were bad. At this point, a return to the 90s would be a breath of fresh air.
It would, wouldn't it? And the 90s weren't that great.
No.
We were both there. We're both old enough. A lot of younger people, I've heard younger guys say, back in the 90s when things made sense. And what I would say is that no, things made a little more sense back then. And actually, we had a nice period in the 90s, toward the end of the 90s especially, where people were kind of making fun of feminists and had about enough of them. Then it all changed over the last 20 years, and feminism's gotten worse than ever. And feminism, I'm sorry, anybody who thinks you can be a feminist and still pro-male is a fool. There's nothing in feminism that is anything other than anti-male in some sense or another. Although and that's why, because what they'll do is they'll retreat to the dictionary. You know, they'll treat like an atheist will retreat and say, my atheism is just like a belief. They'll say feminism is just a belief in women's equality. Well, no, that's not what it is in reality. They rely on terrible history to portray women as having been viciously oppressed and beaten, and it's not true, or denied basic rights. It's not true. We could talk about how women were denied the right to vote, and you could even talk about that as if it was a deprivation or an injustice. You can hold that position. But even when you're talking about women getting the vote historically, quite a few women at the time thought it was not a good idea. Mm-hmm. A lot of the people who were opposed to women's suffrage were women for any number of reasons. And you don't even have to like their reasons to realize that they had them. And furthermore, especially in the UK and a lot of other countries, quite frequently women, at least privileged women of privilege, women of means, got the vote before poor men did. And a lot of the women suffragists wanted it that way because they only wanted, educated, wealthy women having the vote. They didn't want all women having the vote. In fact, one of the dirtiest secrets of all is when they gave women the vote in the United States with the passage of the 19th Amendment, the white suffragist women threw the black suffragist women under the bus and did not fight for black women or men's right to vote. And that had to come later. So the real history of all these things is complex, and feminists don't tell the truth about it. That's the biggest problem of all, I'd say. They don't tell the truth about history.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Biggest problem with feminism, I don't know when this first came out, and maybe it existed before it had a name, but if people ask me, why don't you like feminism? I say the biggest problem I have is 2 words: patriarchy theory. You there?
yeah, I'm still there. Go on ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that's 2 words: patriarchy theory. The whole thing is repackaged, reheated Marxism, and I mean there may be snippets of truth in it, but it's very misleading, and that's what's set up this antagonistic situation.
I see we have. I agree with you completely. I see that we have some. We have the peanut gallery has come on in here, and we got commenters saying that what we're saying is BS. Can't say what it's. He's called break the change, and he's calling BS on us. He doesn't say what's BS. Then we have someone called Marshall Villager coming in to say men who hate feminism are probably fragile. No, I'm sorry. Men who hate feminism, just exactly like women, have and women who hate feminism are common. We have very good, very rational reasons to despise feminists, whether they're male feminists or not, because feminists, whether they're male or female, are bullies and thugs for the most part, and they're very, very hateful and they're very, very bigoted. And my experience with most feminist men is that they are creeps who really have a misogyny problem and a sexual obsession problem. Most of them are fatherless men, in fact. Now, Carl doesn't have to agree with me on all this, but no. Feminists are hateful bullies who say things like, if you're not a feminist, you're just fragile. Well, take it back. Snippets of truth. What snippets of truth does he see in it? You see snippets of truth in feminism?
Well, what I
There are.
meant
There's
by
lots
that
of snippets
was
of truth. Go ahead.
kind of be kind of a little bit generous to say, like, yeah, for example, you mentioned the vote. For example, women didn't have the right to vote. For example, so I mean that is a true statement, but they're not looking at the big picture. Like we said, there are many countries where men didn't have the right to vote either. I mean, there are a lot of countries when there was never a time when only men could vote. Also, it may have only been upper class men. And you mentioned that, yeah, one of feminism's dirty little secrets is they did not want all women to vote necessarily. They just thought the female equivalents of the males who could vote at the time should be allowed to vote.
Right.
And
right. And country after country, it went that way. In fact, quite a bit of time, so-called feminists were advocating for privileged women like themselves to get the vote, but not all women, and certainly not all men. And that's just a historical fact. I think that if I were to answer this one myself, when you say there's snippets of truth in feminism, I'll give you the biggest one that everybody believes, the feminists have not let go of in 50 years, no matter how many times it's debunked: the wage gap. The belief in the wage gap has been debunked 500 times from Sunday. I mean, it is ridiculous how easily it's debunked. The reality is that you could say the wage gap is true in the sense that women do earn less on average than men do, but it has been shown time and time again, and so that you could call a snippet of truth. On average, women earn less. On the other hand, women also do less work that's likely to get you to be paid. It's been shown over and over again that the vast majority of this has to do with the choices that women make. Furthermore, what you would have to point out is that even if men are earning more, government assistance, redistribution of wealth, falls more on women than men. In other words, women get more government benefits in the United States, in Canada, in all over Europe. They get more benefits, they get more protections, they get special consideration for hiring and promotion just because they have a vagina and a womb. It is ludicrous, So the snippet of truth in feminism is, yes, there's an earnings gap. There's also, however, a government benefits gap, which women benefit massively from. And women benefit from a social structure that says men should be expected to support women, not the other way around. That's still there, and feminists are not undoing that. At some point, unless feminists bring men's advocates to the table and are willing to talk openly about these problems and not shut men up, and not tell non-feminist men what to do or think, and not tell non-feminist women what to do or think, I'm sorry, why should anybody listen to a feminist at all? Feminism has always been unpopular. It has never represented. There was a brief period in the 1970s where slightly more than half of women surveyed by Gallup said they would identify as feminists. It was a very, very brief time period when they were trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Subsequently, the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass, in large part because women voters didn't want it. And really, where we're at right now is still, we're down to under 20% of women wanting anything, wanting to call themselves feminists. And yet feminist men and women alike beat up on and abuse and snarl at any woman who won't be a feminist and any man who won't be a feminist. They just demean you and mock you, even though we who are not feminists are in the majority of women, as well as in the majority of men. In fact, if anything, you'll find that men are a little more likely to self-identify as feminists than women are. Feminism is an ideology, and it's time more people call that out. And not try to play this word game, I think. I mean, have you run into these guys who try that? I'm a feminist too, so therefore we should look at these men's issues. We should look at women's violence and all that. And the feminists don't want to do it, do they?
Look, I have written some feminist groups on behalf of NCFM, offering to meet with them. If you check out my video about, I'm trying to get a global treaty for men's rights to complement, not replace, but to complement the one made in the 70s, Saddam. I want a Saddam. And I say in the video, if feminists are willing to work with me on this, I will work with them. I will work with literally anybody who will work with me. And I mean that, pretty much anybody.
Well, watch out, because some people within the men's rights movement, just so you know, are virulent Christian haters, which I've run into with a few of them a few times. So you got to watch out for that one. But otherwise, and I got screwed by being willing to work with some Christian haters. I won't do it anymore. So I'd be careful if I were you, and just, when you say anybody, make sure you're not siding up with somebody who really hates you or has no respect for you. But otherwise, I tend to agree. Whether you're left-wing, right-wing, religious or not, everybody should care about this. It's something like more than 80% of the populace does not self-identify as feminist. Why are the majority of us who are not feminists required to kiss feminist butt and care about feminist feelings and listen to feminist whining when they won't listen to anybody who's not a feminist who has a different point of view? That's totally the way I see it. And I think that's fair, don't you?
Yes. I mean, it is shocking how this percentage of the population just kind of runs roughshod over the rest of us.
Yes, and it is a rest of us. If you look at people who are in either the men's movement in general, there's different factions and splinters within the men's rights movement, within MGTOW, within etc. But you will find that men and women alike, all over the planet and all over the country, tend to have a real negative view of feminism and don't want to be associated with it. And what I keep finding over and over again is that the feminist male response is most putrid. Feminist males are the worst. Feminist males will not only berate and sneer at and bully non-feminist men, but feminist men will be total misogynists to any woman who says, I'm not a feminist. They'll turn complete and total misogynist on non-feminist women, i.e., the majority of women. This is also true of feminist women, but I want to call it out for male feminists especially. Misogyny out of male feminists is an everyday occurrence. All it takes is a woman who won't toe the line and be feminist with him, and that's the end. He turns into a complete misogynist. So do feminist women. And simply saying these things out loud may infuriate them, but once you observe it, you can't unobserve it, can you? I'm sure you've observed everything I just said.
Oh, yeah.
It's very obvious that the feminist population is like this. And I got to tell you, people will mock us. They'll say, "Oh, look at you! You're a whiny man baby with your hat and your tie and whatever," and they'll just mock you, right? But and the reason they do the mocking is they cannot answer anything specific we're saying. They can't answer anything specific we're saying. If they do, they're toast, because feminism lies, and feminists lie. And feminists are hateful bullies much of the time. And I take Fiedelbogen's line. I don't know if you know who Fiedelbogen is. He doesn't call himself a men's rights activist, but he says, I am part of the non-feminist majority. How about you? And that's a good way of starting. I'm a non-feminist. That puts me in the solid majority of the population. What's wrong with being a non-feminist? Is feminism optional, or is it mandatory? I'd like to know. Blah blah blah. That's just me talking. So you would mostly align yourself with National Coalition for Men, right?
Yes, I've been a member of this group for nearly a decade now. I'm a liaison contact, and I am the official international coordinator.
Oh, well, that's very cool. That's very cool. I haven't talked to Harry Crouch and the others at NCFM for a while, but I've been an NCFM member for quite a few years. I even won a communications award from them back in, I think, 2014. NCFM is a pretty good group. They have some problems, but one of the things I like best about NCFM is, well, they don't do a lot of lobbying. They don't do a lot of public stuff, advocacy, but what they do is they file a lot of lawsuits, and they win quite a few of them. And they do spread awareness of the issues. So I can definitely still, it's not a perfect organization, but NCFM is pretty good. Are there others that you've worked with or enjoyed working with? Or is it primarily NCFM?
This is the main one I've worked with. I know of others, but I've been an NCFM member. That's the one I've worked through.
Well, it's wise to be associated with a group like that. And I'd have to say that NCFM is one of the more reputable ones. There's other men's groups, including ones I used to affiliate with, that I'd say stay away from. But NCFM is pretty solid. You got good people there like Harry Crouch, R.K. Hendrick, and quite a few others. They're a group I'm not afraid to say I still support. Now, what do you say to more conservative-minded people? I'd like to get your take on this. More conservative-minded people who are not feminists, may not even like feminists, who still look at you and say, what are you, a big goober whiner? Men are supposed to protect and take care of women. What's your problem, you big whiner? What do you say to a conservative or even a Christian who talks to you that way?
Well, I say that I do genuinely believe in equality, and I think, yes, I protect women, but women should protect men. It should be sort of, we should have each other's backs, is what I think.
Okay, but the phrase equality is really a big, I forget what a troubling word for a lot of people, because what they're going to think is that you're going to want to advocate for basically a Marxist style or an ideological style where we have equal outcomes for men and women on everything. That seems to be what a lot of feminism is based on. Are you saying you want to achieve complete equality that way?
No, not at all. In fact, it breaks my heart that the word equality has been given such a bad name, well, to some extent a bad name because of feminism. I forget what the page was. It was a mostly conservative page, and one person said, yeah, the problem came when we fought for equality, and I said, I'm a big believer in equality. He said, well, that's where all our problems came from. And my point is, no, we've not had a drive for equality. We've had a drive for feminism. I want to drive for equality. And as we always say, I believe in equality of opportunity. I believe in equality under the law. I do not necessarily believe in equality of outcome. That's not necessary.
Okay, so when you say equality, what kind of definition of equality are you using?
Well, for example, I mentioned the military service requirements. Those laws should apply equally to men and women. Here in the Republic of Georgia, the retirement age for men is 65. It's 60 for women. That's totally unfair. Men and women same retirement age.
Women can retire better. They get more government benefits, etc. Marshall Villager, who did not actually answer anything that we said, says, you keep repeating how unpopular feminism is, but what does that have to do with whether or not the claims they're making are true? The thing is, they make untrue claims all the time, and that's one of the reasons they're unpopular. We've already given you perfect examples of where they lie in their claims, sir. Feminists lie all the time, and that lying is why they're unpopular. And then look at this. Typical shaming tactic. Here it goes. You feel like women are bullying you? LOL. Women in general aren't bullying me, no. But women can be a horrific bully. And what kind of sexist, misogynist man would claim that women are never bullies towards each other or towards men? Female bullying is a real thing, sir. It tends to work a little different. Let me point out a link or two, just so you can just go into the internet and look up female bullying. There's a serious problem with female bullies. They tend to use their mouths more than their fists. Mind you, when women do get violent, they can get very violent indeed. In fact, I will repeat something I mentioned earlier. Women are responsible for most child homicides. Women are also responsible for most violent child abuse in general. This is simply a fact about women, which means, of course, education programs to help deal with domestic violence, child abuse, and such should be aimed at women as much as they're aimed at men, but they're not. They're aimed at men. Like, I'll give you statistically, the demographic most likely to kill a child is a stepmother or a mother, especially in the first 4 to 7 years. And the one least likely to kill or seriously injure a child is the biological father. By far, the safest place a child can be is in his father's arms, not even necessarily his mother's, his or hers. And that's just one of many examples. If you look into the way physical bullying is less common in girls, but definitely happens, when women do get violent, they tend to get more violent overall. They're more likely to hair pull and try and cause permanent scarrings to a face. Actually, statistically, women are more likely to use poison and to use things like acid against their enemies. Women also use gossip, lying about somebody to take down their reputation. I mean, men do all these things too. But what kind of idiot thinks women don't get around, gossip, spread rumors, belittle people, mock them sexually, mock them otherwise? Like, really, female bullies love to bully. Female bullies love to bully men sexually. They also love to bully women sexually. Female bullies also are often guilty of rape, and the system and society lets them have a pass on it. So yeah, when somebody laughs at me when I say that there is a problem with female bullying, I say again, what are you, a stinking misogynist? You don't think women are capable of being vile and evil and manipulative and abusive? You think they're somehow not as good at that as men are? I'm sorry, but you're nuts. And yeah, no, I these days I tend to be outright just disgusted when somebody tells me they're a feminist, and I don't care if it hurts their feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings. Feminism is deeply hated, and it's hated for very, very, very good reasons, and we've given you specifics you can't even refute. So what?
Yeah, I think feminist chances, they didn't realize I was doing this, but I mentioned some of these horrible quotes, from Dworkin and others, and I was actually looking for them to kind of reassure me, oh gosh, that's not us, so we have a few nuts in the movement, ignore them. But they wouldn't. They would make excuses for them. I was appalled. And then finally I asked point blank, do you agree with these statements? Well, no, they didn't agree with them, but
I understood them somehow. And yeah, you've got horrible feminists saying sex is, all men are potential rapists. Mm-hmm. All men are, in fact, rape is a process by which women are kept in a state of fear by men, consciously and unconsciously. That's all androphobia. That's all fear of men and deeply bigoted. And I would argue rooted in real androphobia, clinical androphobia. In fact, I think that if you look through feminists, especially the famous ones, whether you go back to the 60s and 70s with people like Shulamith Firestone and the 70s, Andrea Dworkin, Gloria Steinem, Susan Brown Miller, you look at their life histories, all of them had shatteringly bad relationships with their fathers and with their mothers. They all came from abusive backgrounds, all of them. And frequently it was their mothers who were abusive, but they tended to blame their fathers anyway. So I don't know what got me off on all this, but it's fascinating how feminists, male feminists or female feminists, generally think the way that they respond to you when you point out hypocrisy or dishonesty in feminists, or hatefulness from feminists, or even viciousness and violence from feminists, their response is to laugh at you. And by the way, that response of laughing and mocking is just more reason to hate feminists. Instead of taking the issue seriously, they mock. I'm curious now, you've been in a bunch of different countries, so I'm sure you've seen the influence of anti-male stuff all over the place. Where have you been where you'd say you see the least of it?
Perhaps here. Republic of Georgia has been fairly good. I mean, Eastern Europe in general seems better than Western Europe or North America.
That
Not that
doesn't
it's problems
surprise
here,
me.
but
Yeah, Kantaka rolls in and says, and he's right, women can bully people, and certainly they can bully other women and children. Absolutely they do. And one more time, what kind of sexist misogynist would deny it? That's truly the way of asking it.
I think all these people need to get to know the life story of Aaron Pitsey.
They do. My old friend Aaron Pitsey, who started the world's first known women's shelter, and I used to do a show with her very, very, very regularly, because Aaron started the battered women's shelter movement back in the '70s. This Aaron Chiswick. This is her book. She's a fascinating lady, called This Way to the Revolution. And it's a whole history on how feminists took over and hijacked her domestic violence movement, that and some others. Because she was a feminist for about 5 minutes and then walked away from it because she hated it. And one of the things that she was hated by the feminists for was simply telling the truth. She opens the world's first domestic violence shelter for women. And she finds very quickly, she even eventually published a peer-reviewed paper working with some other social scientists on this. But she quickly found that not just a lot, but a majority of the women who came into that shelter that she was running, a majority of them, like 60%, okay, a solid majority, had a serious violence problem of their own and had a tendency to beat up on and otherwise abuse their children, and even to get violent with their men. And just for saying, and she said early on, if we're going to do this, we need shelters for men too. And we need ways to help men who are in these relationships. And she couldn't get any support. In fact, what she got was censored and hated eventually booted out of anything feminist or most official domestic violence stuff. The feminist movement, the anti-male feminist movement, has gotten billions of dollars over the year to run anti-domestic violence shelters for women. And in reality, what they wind up doing is hurting a lot of the women that go into those shelters and making things worse for them, and making things worse for the children, and not holding the women accountable for their own violence. It's a serious problem, because you'll get women go into these shelters and they'll have a violence problem. Or sometimes the women working in the shelters will have a violence problem. And we've seen a number of reports of women going into a battered women's shelter only to be beat up by the women in there. Or otherwise.
I read some cases in Sweden. Some of the women were sexually assaulted by the women running the shelters.
Yep, it's been known to happen. I mean, I'm not picking on LGBT or anything, but a lot of them are angry lesbians. And yeah, it's not unusual for you to see. The women's shelters are run by ideologues. They're run by hateful ideologues all over the world, including near where I live here. And you talk about it, and they sneer and they act like, "Oh, so you think it's okay to beat up women, right?" It's so noxious and obnoxious because they pretend they care about domestic violence. They pretend they care about children in these situations, and then everything they do makes it worse for everybody. And they get away with it. No one calls them on it. And more people need to.
I call it the wolf in shepherd's clothing, analogy.
Oh, it is. It is. They talk a good game about helping people, but in helping women and helping children and making a better world, and they constantly make it worse. They constantly make it worse. This is another reason why most women aren't feminists, and probably most women never will be. Do you still see? We should probably be wrapping this up soon, but do you still see yourself? I mean, are you seeing stuff in like where you live now that you think needs addressing there in Georgia, or are you more concerned with the international scene?
Well, I mentioned there are two things in Georgia. There's military service requirement, and there's the retirement age issue. But even here, I was invited to some seminar about women's issues a little over a year ago. I sat patiently in the audience the whole time. And some of the things that they mentioned I thought were a little exaggerated. Georgia's not 100% perfect. It's a very tricky language. And I remember Went up afterwards to the ombudsman, introduced myself. I said, I'm with the National Coalition for Men. Look, a shock on her face. Oh, men? Oh, we don't have any issues, discrimination against men. Legislative, she even said. You could have knocked me over with a feather. I didn't go to the military service thing first. I said the retirement age. What's the retirement age here? She said, oh, it's a matter of opinion as to whether that's discrimination. I said, yes. Remember, 60 for women, 65 for men. That's an opinion if it's discrimination. By the way, the life expectancy here is 69 for men, 77 for women.
Our friend Kantaka, who, by the way, Kantaka, you ought to come on and do a stream with us one of these days, man. Haven't seen you in ages. Anyway, Kantaka said, or he suggests, and I don't know if I agree with him because I haven't thought it through, but he says Charles Fourier was the utopian socialist who invented feminism, the man who invented socialism, Charles Fourier. It's very possible it was him. There's debate over it. A lot of people think the feminism that we know today came out of the Rockefellers and the CIA. And by the way, there's real evidence for that. But yeah, no, one of the dirty secrets about feminism is that frequently it's been men who are giving these women money. It's been men who are, joining and encouraging women in these things, being so-called allies. But in reality, feminists have been dependent on men to give them money and support from the beginning. And that kind of puts the lie to the whole idea that feminism is about women doing everything for themselves, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I myself favor a much more sensible thing. Nobody has to be restricted in gender roles. Nobody has to be told, well, you're a girl, so you can't be a fireman, or you're a boy, so you can't be a nurse. That's ridiculous. At the same time, though, simply letting people take their God-given abilities and talents and put them into the direction they want to go with their lives, whatever it is, that would seem the more sensible approach for everybody, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Which is what I say when I believe in equality. I reject traditional gender roles. But at the same time, if a majority of women want more female traditional roles and a majority of men want more traditional male roles, hey, that's cool too.
Well, I mean, you say you reject traditional gender roles, but what do you mean by that? I mean, I certainly see you wearing a necktie and you seem to have a pretty masculine thing going on there. I mean, what do you mean by rejecting gender roles? I reject enforced gender roles.
I think that's what I meant. I reject pigeonholing people into it.
Oh, that's right. So if you're one of those, if you're in a relationship and you don't like squishing bugs and your wife doesn't mind squishing the bugs or whatever, who cares, right?
The wife who works and the father who stays home with the kids, I'm totally cool with that.
I see it having problems, but it can work. It can work. Although I will say, this is just a reality of psychology. An awful lot of men in that situation wind up having their women divorcing them and resenting them. So you got to be careful about that one. But it doesn't always happen. And yeah, I mean, if a woman wants to be a soldier or a fireman or whatever she wants to be, as long as she can actually do the job and doesn't need everybody to help her. And you would say the same for a man, right? I mean, if a man wants to be a kindergarten teacher or whatever, he should be able to do that without a problem. Yeah, but there's the thing. The feminists talk about how they oppose gender roles, but they seem ready to assign roles to everybody.